Hi there, well welcome to this overview of the Planning Scope module, one of the resources available through the updated version of Conservation by Design. I'm Dave Patrick, I'm Program Director for Conservation by Design, and I've also played the lead in developing the Planning Scope module, so really excited to take this opportunity to tell you more about it. But before we go any further, I do want to define what I mean by scope, given that this is the Planning Scope module. So when we talk about the scope of a strategy, we're really summarizing our agreement on what a strategy encompasses, and importantly, what it does not. And so this helps a team, those engaged with the strategy as a whole, sort of understand the strategic and geographic boundaries, really understand sort of the arena within which we're going to be developing and ultimately implementing this strategy. So this module is a little bit different to many of our other modules, through Conservation by Design, in that we didn't actually have a plan of developing this module when we started updating Conservation by Design. But what we came to find was that as teams were going through the other modules, things like a theory of change or a situation analysis, there was a common scenario emerging. And what we were seeing was the teams or the facilitators were recognizing that with some teams there was strong divergence among critical elements of scope within the team members. And what I mean by this is that some team members might have thought, for example, that the scope of the strategy was at a national boundary, whereas others might think it was at a global boundary. And these kinds of differences in scope really meant that the team couldn't successfully go through the module, couldn't successfully move forward with developing a strategy until they were resolved. And what we were seeing was one of two scenarios. Either teams were, when those points of divergence emerged, teams would storm and they really couldn't make any progress, or, and actually more commonly, the team would sort of ignore those differences in scope. And as a result, when they finished a particular module, what the output looked like was this really broad and sort of often very vague kind of product. And the team themselves were disappointed with that and really wanted to make sure that they were focusing in on the work that was really relevant to their needs and to the strategy they were looking to develop. So the Planning Scope module then was designed in response to the requests that came from our teams, and really to provide a venue to help teams first assess if there are those key points of divergence, and if so, to then have a facilitated conversation and ultimately to make a decision around, for each of those factors, should they be considered in scope or out of scope by the team moving forwards. So because this module is really designed to sort of set teams up for success with subsequent modules, we do place it at the beginning of sort of the typical order of planning steps, and you'll see that represented in the figure in front of you right now. And so, for those teams that have some idea that there may be these key points of divergence in scope, we really do encourage them to take the Planning Scope module early, because without doing so, again, those points of storming and those challenges quickly emerge as they move into other modules. And this module is one of our shorter modules. It can be undertaken in 3 hours or a little bit less. And so it's one where, that time is sort of well spent, because again, it allows the teams to be much more efficient then as they step into subsequent steps in the planning process. So I do want to sort of talk a little bit about what you can expect, what this module does, and critically sort of what it doesn't do, in terms of what the team will cover during the module. So this module does help teams again, really sort of surface any of those really important points of divergence and then resolve those key elements of scope so that the team has a shared understanding, has a shared agreement around whether or not they're in or out of the scope. What it doesn't do is sort of understand all of the factors that might make up the scope of a particular strategy. That is in many ways really a key part of the work of developing a strategy. And so that's better, better suited to other modules, particularly our situation analysis module. That's where the teams really have the chance to look at all of the different elements that might make up the scope of the strategy. Nor is this module designed to help teams if they realize that sort of under the surface of those points of divergence, there are underlying issues. That could be issues with team dynamics, it could be challenges around management. And obviously those kinds of issues, really need to be solved within the management line for the team itself. So because this is a formative sort of early stage module, there isn't a lot of pre-work that you need to do in terms of getting ready to go through the module. Now, unusually with this module, we do actually suggest to teams that we're better off going through the module itself only with Nature Conservancy staff, rather than, as we often encourage, engaging a wider network of our interested parties in actually developing the strategy itself. And the reason we make this sort of recommendation is that, many teams having these kind of early stage conversations around quite sensitive topics feel much safer if it's a close group where they can have those candid conversations, where they can surface concerns, and there's not a reputational risk, that might be present if we did have, external parties present during those discussions. Because this is a formative module again, really not a lot of preparation here. There is an option if teams want to take it to do some pre-work, in service of the module itself, and that just means that when the teams actually go through the steps in the module, they're able to skip some of the early steps and go through the remaining steps much more quickly. So what are the major steps involved? Well, the first step that the team will go through is to really sort of name what are those possible points of divergence, what are those possible sort of elements of scope where the team already has some sense that there might be divergence, and where those elements sort of really matter to the scope of the strategy. Yeah. So the team begins by sort of building out that initial list of essentially points of concern, and then we actually take the team through a step of assessing: are you already aligned? And sometimes that's the case. The team members actually all agree on whether or not a particular factor should be in or out of scope, so we can note that, and then we can hone in on that remaining list of those factors, those elements, where there remains that divergence. And that's the final step then, where the facilitator will take you through having a conversation around those elements and ultimately making a decision about each of them as to whether or not it should be in or out of scope. So in terms of sort of the products that come out of the planning scope module, the first is that list of key factors that the team identified and a decision point on whether or not for each of those factors they're in or out of scope. What we also find though is that there's typically really rich dialogue as the team kind of goes through those facilitated conversations. And there's some nuance that comes out, yeah? And we capture that. We want to make sure that the team has access to that information afterwards. And one aspect of that nuance is that, quite often a team will decide, well, this is sort of in scope. This element is in scope, but it's really sort of peripheral to our strategy. It's something that, we're going to be considering, but it's not a direct focus of our efforts. It's not a challenge we're looking to solve, for example. And so we have a visual. It's a simple series of concentric circles where the facilitator can capture where those elements the team discusses sort of fall within the scope of the strategy. And that helps them kind of have that understanding of, again, is this a focus? Is this element a focus of the strategy? Or is it something that we really are just going to be kind of keeping an eye on as we move forward? So as I mentioned already, the planning scope module really sets teams up for success in subsequent modules. So in many ways, it's sort of, is a great entry point for any of the remaining modules that a team might decide to step through. But there are a couple of modules that I'd speak to where it really can help the team be more effective and more efficient as they go through that module. And the two that I have here on the slide are the defining objectives and the situation analysis. And the reason that the planning scope conversations can be helpful with these two sort of subsequent modules is it can mean that the team doesn't have to sort of re-explore the same ground. So for example, the team should not define an objective that relates to an element of scope they've decided is out of scope for the strategy, nor they may decide not to spend a lot of time building out part of a situation analysis module again, where that diagram relates to elements, factors that have the team has decided are out of scope. So we've seen the planning scope module really help teams be focused as they step into subsequent modules, and particularly the two that I have named in the slide here. So with that, I hope I've provided you a sort of a useful overview of the planning scope module. If you do want to learn more, I really encourage you to check out our conservationbydesign.org website. There you'll find a tab where you can look at the modules, you can dig as deep as you would like on any of the modules, and you can find a lot more information and resources relating to this particular module, to the planning scope module, again, linked through our website. Thanks so much for your time and attention today. I really do appreciate it.